You're listening to Stand Tall and Own It, the podcast for high-performing female leaders who are ready to make an impact by discovering the safety that comes from understanding their own value and exercising their own authority. I'm your host, Andrea Johnson, and I'm here to tell you it is time to just truly be you, my strong friend. It's time to stand tall and own it. Hey there, welcome back to another episode of Stand Tall and Own It. I'm your host, Andrea Johnson, the Intentional Optimist, and this is the fourth episode in a series dedicated to demonstrating how and where your core values can be integrated and implemented to employ them in your life and business. You know, I've been blessed to have the opportunity to apply core values principles to a really wide variety of audiences through a number of podcast interviews. The process has increased my understanding, it's made me a better coach, and it's deepened my devotion to this work of empowering you to live in a way that honors your non-negotiables. Now, this is the final one in a series of episodes answering some specific questions. The first was, are there core values common to different personality types? And I think there are, so go listen to that one. I break it down by disc type. The second one was answering the question, can I use my core values in parenting? Either my own core values or understanding my kids. And that one's already gotten some great response. Now, in the last episode, we looked at the question, how can I employ my core values in my branding and marketing? And before you think, well, I'm not a business owner, I don't need that, we're talking personal branding. So it's how you show up in your community, how people perceive you, maybe in your job. So you definitely need that one. And finally, today, we're going to answer the question, in what ways do core values show up in intergenerational communication and relationships? Interesting, no? Because core values are always present, they always influence, and they always get honored one way or another, either yours or someone else's. Now, if you're new here, welcome. I am excited to meet you. I am excited you're here. And a podcaster, one of these podcasters I interviewed with, actually called me the core values lady. So I'm starting to embrace that. And there's a lot of conversation out there in business or in just personal growth settings that talk about core values and how they show up or how we can identify ours. And so I think that because of that, I'm very careful to define the way I present core values. I do not see them as aspirational goals. I don't see them as life principles. I have a whole set of life principles. You can go back and look at mine, the intentional optimism tenets. My definition of core values goes a little bit like this. These are the principles and priorities that guide your actions. They represent the foundational convictions that allow you to navigate complex situations while keeping your identity and authority right at the forefront, meaning through all the twists and turns and waves and winds and whatever you deal with in life, you don't lose you. These are your inner compass, your hardwiring, the things that make you, well, you. And I think they are essential for an authentic leadership impact. Now, true confession, I struggled with whether or not to actually put this particular episode out there. I don't like conflict. I prefer not to highlight the things that separate us into groups. I like to highlight the things that actually unite us and that we have in common. I also don't ever want to do anything that would promote or encourage any kind of discrimination. But I think that the skills and principles that I teach and stand for are essential in how we work, play, and communicate. So here we are, and I'll address any of those concerns if they come up in relevant spots. I think I've written a good enough outline for myself that I know that I think I'm going to do this in a way that will not do those things. So just know that as you listen, if for some reason I say something that you think would cause that, know that that is not my intention. Please let me know, and I will be happy to address it with you or address it publicly, but I don't think there's anything that I hope there's nothing I will do or say that would cause that. Now, also, I didn't really know what a generational definition was. I mean, I thought, I know I'm a Gen Xer, and I know my son is a Gen Z, and I thought my dad was a baby boomer. He is not. And so I went looking for a definition, and in a nutshell, the simplest definition is it's a group of people living contemporaneously. It's those of us living at the same time. They can range anywhere from 20 to 30 years, depending on the events, but it's usually a group of people born within a certain period of time whose shared age and experiences shape a distinct worldview, how they see things, right? It's the lens through which they look. They each have defining events and generally known traits, but these are high level, right? These are not defining of anyone. These are cultural phenomenons. And I want to make sure that we don't use them to define somebody else, right? It is a good sometimes explanation of certain things and why certain people act certain ways. And especially when we act in a group, we tend to be more alike in these areas. But for the first time in history, there are six generations represented in the workforce. Why? Well, we're living longer for one. We have better medical care, but we're also a little worse off financially. And so people are working longer because they need to. But additionally, work is increasingly less and less physical labor, so you can stay in the workforce longer. People are staying there and just working until they really just want to quit. I mean, I had one woman that was a staff member for me, and she was well past retirement age. She's like, I'll retire when I get bored. I'm like, all right then. But additionally, on top of that, because of technology, some are getting in the workforce earlier, right? Now, as far back as I can remember, I've heard the phrase, kids these days, uttered by pretty much anybody over 40. And it was usually accompanied by the requisite eye roll and sneer. What happens when you have 4 generations saying that right down the line, right? Kids, of course, always responded, the kids in quotes, with something like, in today's parlance, yeah, whatever, boomer. It seems like nobody's listening and nobody seems to care. Now, if you've not experienced conflict between generations, either at work, at home, which is usually where I experience it, not in my house, but I'll share that in a minute, at church a lot, or in your community, I'd be very, very surprised. But what I want you to know is that while understanding your core values will not help you magically relate to each of the 7 living generations walking the planet right this second, it will help you build bridges, encourage, get along with, mentor, and learn from all of them. Because knowing and honoring your core values decreases your defensiveness. You know who you are. It increases healthy boundaries in communication. You know where you end and they begin. And it increases the amount of grace that you give yourself and others. Because you only know what you know when you know it, not before. Of course, I'm not an expert on the topic of generations, so I had to do a little research for this episode, and I'm going to be sharing some links in the show notes. One of them is an Indeed article about the 6 generations currently in the workforce. One is A Parent's Guide for Gen Z by access.org, which is a Christian ministry, so if that's not your thing, feel free to find another one. I'm sure it's not hard, and I'm kind of referencing this one myself on the daily since I have a Gen Zer in the house. And then a book by Tim Elmore titled A New Kind of Diversity, Making the Different Generations on Your Team a Competitive Advantage. And I actually wrote this sentence this book puts feet to the principles of how intergenerational relationships can flourish, even with all the diversity out there. And that was before I remembered that he's got feet representing each one of the generations in the workforce on the cover of this book. It's quite good. But first, before we dive into how we can do that, let's have a little bit of fun. In case, like me, you did not know what all the generations were and what defined them. And in case you missed it a minute ago, I mentioned 7 living generations. 7. That just blows my mind. So here's what they are, and each one of them has some defining things and what they're known for. And I'll just run through them kind of quickly, maybe give you a little bit of my own commentary. But the 7 living generations start with the greatest generation. This one used to be called the GI generation. They were kind of renamed by Tom Brokaw. They were born between 1901 and 1924. Defining events for them include things like the Great Depression, World War II, of course, and FDR's New Deal. They're known for their really strong work ethic, their high morals, and their sense of duty. I mean, these people built out the infrastructure of North America. 7 U.S. presidents have come from this generation: Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, and Bush. That means they're also very powerful. They have shaped a lot of what we considered traditional at least in the United States. Of course, I'm doing this from the U.S. perspective. So if you're listening somewhere else, I'm sure there's things that you can apply to each one of these generations that make sense where you're coming from. But this is a really powerful generation, and because of all the things that they've gone through and they've done, it's a little understandable to see why Tom Brokaw would call them the greatest generation. The next generation is currently called the silent generation, or the lucky few. These were born between 1925 and 1945. This is the one where my parents fall in. I was a little surprised, but both of them fall into this generation, and they were shaped, and the defining events were things like the Korean War in the 50s, the space race, the moon landing, McCarthyism, and the Cold War. This generation has usually been described as grave and fatalistic. And if you know my family at all, we call my dad Eeyore, and that makes total sense. He's not really Eeyore, but he's the one who can be fatalistic about things. But they also don't want to buck the system. They're very much toe the line, do the right thing, because that's just who they are. That's how they were raised. Employment rates for this generation were always very high. Gender roles, very traditional. Joe Biden is the first president from this generation. He may be the only president from this generation, but he is the first one. So it's very silent. They have not spoken a lot to kind of the culture from that powerful perspective. The next generation is one that everybody knows and kind of talks about a lot right now, is the baby boomers. These were born between 1946 and 1964. Defining events for them include Vietnam, both the war and the protests, Watergate, Woodstock, all the assassinations, have mercy, and for the first time, televisions were in the home. This is the only generation named by the U.S. Census Bureau because of the dramatic increase in the birth rate. They should have been, I guess, Generation X. I don't know, whatever comes before X. I can't do it backwards. I'm just one of those people. But they're the only ones named by the Census Bureau. They tend to be questioners of authority. They came of age in the middle of some phenomenal cultural change all across the globe. And gender roles are still pretty traditional, although women started working outside the home in the baby boomer generation. But by the time they got older and kind of now, I guess, with the fact that they've retired, a lot of them, they're kind of settling into much more traditional thinking. But they have 4 U.S. presidents. Clinton, W., Obama, and Trump are all baby boomers. So for the longest time, we thought that baby boomers were going to completely define everything for the next 100 years. But we'll get to that because we have another generation that's quite large. The one after the baby boomers we used to be called the baby busters because the birth rate dropped significantly, but we have come to call ourselves Generation X. That's me, born between 1965 and 1980. Defining events include things like the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, the AIDS epidemic, and I want my MTV. I remember when MTV came out. Growing up in Korea, I didn't always have things like that. So when we were home, my 10th grade year of high school, I remember watching MTV. It was so cool watching all of the music videos and to see things differently. It like completely changed the way I thought of music. And so therefore, things were not just audio, they were now visual. And here we are, now we're in this YouTube generation, right? So Gen Z is a much smaller generation sandwiched between 2 really big ones. And we are currently seen and kind of, defined as cynical, which, I get it. I graduated in 1984 and we looked at Orwell's novel and thought, is that really what we're going to be coming to? Is this really defining us? But Gen Z tends to be very individualistic, very motivated to learn. And when I read this, I went straight to my husband and told him, the first generation where women overall have more education than men. Y'all should listen to us, right? However, they also have great personal debt and tend to be the latchkey kids from divorced families. Not me personally, but this was very common. And we do not yet have a U.S. president representing us in the White House. So we will see whether or not we do. The next generation is the millennials. Born between 1981 and 96, defining events include things like 9/11, the Obama election, the Great Recession, and the rise of the internet. I remember when I first got on the internet, I was in grad school, and people were already talking about getting lost on the internet. And I remember thinking, how on earth? I go in and I look for one thing, and this is like in the early 90s, 2004-ish. And I remember thinking, I go into the internet and I search for something and that's it. There's nothing that points me. There was no like redirection and there were no links to next articles and Facebook wasn't around. None of that was around. And so I remember thinking, this is stupid. I'm not going to get lost on the internet. And I kind of still don't, that just because I was not in the generation that was defined by the internet being a common thing. In 2016, millennials surpassed the boomers as the largest living generation. Now, they're less likely to comply with traditional norms, for instance, political parties, religion, or the military, but they are more likely to be optimistic, identify as LGBTQ, and live at home longer, like through their 30s. But part of that because they graduated in the Great Recession when they had these degrees that everybody told them they were supposed to get and they couldn't get a job, right? So this is a lens, right, that they see things through. The next generation is Generation Z, born between 1997 and 2012. Defining events include things like COVID-19, the Me Too movement, George Floyd and all the racial uprisings, big Supreme Court rulings, Dobbs, Obergefell, and the Trump election and insurrection and Brexit. And they're the first to be raised with smartphones. No wonder they're known as the anxious generation. They are, however, hardworking and might even end up as the most entrepreneurial generation. In a world with the first Black president and constitutionally protected same-sex marriage, they are much more relative in their thinking when it comes to identity. So understanding these things about Gen Z is important because if you're a business owner or an employer, they're entering the workforce. You've probably got anywhere from 5 years to 6 years of Gen Zers in your workforce. I personally have one born later in Gen Z who is a high school student. The last generation that is currently living on this planet is Generation Alpha. These are our babies, born between 2013 and 2025, obviously next year, today. They are still emerging. The oldest of this group are only about 12, but they're already displaying an affinity for technology and enhancing customer experiences. I love that. As a Gen Xer, it's like, can you enhance my customer experience? That sounds amazing. And as the future workforce develops, we should expect the need to adapt to their innovative mindset and proficiency with technology. Think AI, right? We're going to have to adapt. Now, you're probably sitting there thinking, all right, Andrea, this is interesting, but why does all this matter? Because the world needs more leaders who are curious, welcoming, and wise. Leaders who understand their core values, recognize their strengths, and live by a clear set of life principles. This foundation enables them to lead with integrity, humility, and authority while mentoring the next generation, which is our responsibility. When leaders truly know who they are, they stop imitating others and they start defining their own principles and priorities, creating a path for sustainable, impactful leadership. And as they embody their unique values, they inspire and empower others to do the same, fostering diversity and authentic leadership across generations. This is the work that I do. This is literally, I just read you the statement for why I do the work that I do, because I really truly believe this is how we will change the world. And we need leaders who can do this. So how, you ask? Well, I have 4 things that I think are important in how we do this. The first is know you. That should not be a surprise. If you listen to me at all, you should know you. See, when you stand tall and own your non-negotiables, you can become an impactful leader who fosters diversity and authentic leadership across generations. But you have to be willing to do the work. You have to be willing to do the work that enables you to be a role model worth emulating. Michael Jordan, a while back, famously said, I never set out to be a role model. I didn't want to be a role model, and I still don't want to be a role model. It's hard work. But if you are a leader at all, you are a role model for someone. If you're a parent, if you're an aunt or an uncle, you're a teacher or you're a role model. You might as well do it well, do it in a good way, right? And whether you fall at the top of the generational tree or at the bottom, I'm guessing you're more likely a millennial, but you might be an X or a Z listening to this podcast. You have a responsibility to foster the best relationships you can with those around you. That's what good leaders do. So first, know you. Second, know them. This is basic stuff, my friend. It is really easy for the larger generations, boomers and millennials, to assume everybody thinks like them. But we don't. Look at those defining events of each generation and pay attention to how that has shaped that particular generation. Learn what's important to them, then go deeper. See them as individuals who, though they might be part of a very definable group of people, have their own experiences and personalities and core values that have shaped who they are now and how they show up. Know them. So know you, know them. And number 3, care enough to build a bridge. Everybody is stressed right now. Everyone feels the pressure of generational differences. You might be in a work situation where all 6 of those generations are represented. My family, my immediate extended family, starting with my dad and my in-laws, has all 6 of these generations represented. We don't have any greatest generations left in our family. You might be the only one, however, who is currently even thinking about personal growth or leadership. So you are the one who can start the work. When you look at the silent generation, they might be kind of done learning. Not on purpose, but my goodness, the youngest ones are turning 80 next year. When you think about boomers, who seem to get a really bad rap in popular culture, they've been through some of the most difficult days in modern history. Gen Xers, y'all, we're just trying to make it, whatever it is. And at the same time, caring for aging parents and kids or grandkids. I have a teenager. My sister, who's almost 5 years younger than me, has grandchildren because we started our families at different times. Millennials, many are working 2 jobs trying to make ends meet, all while raising their children and worrying about their boomer parents. And Gen Zers, what do we say? The anxious generation? They are anxious for so many reasons. Help them see that it can be better. When you care and you show you care, then you can teach. You have to be the role model for how to connect and care. And then you'll open so many doors to make an impact at home or at work. So first know you, then know them, care enough to build a bridge. And number 4, foster the unique contributions of those around you. Building bridges is the first step, but a bridge that's never crossed is useless. They have to be crossed. A bridge to nowhere is useless. So either you're going to cross it by getting to them, or you're going to guide someone or lead someone else across a bridge. Now, there's a saying in therapeutic circles, and because I've been to therapy and stuff, it's like, and my mother even said this, I would like to break the cycle of X, whatever, in my life or in my family. I don't want it to go on to the next generation. A lot of times it's said of codependency or addiction or gaslighting or misogyny or whatever, or patriarchy. And breaking those cycles means we do that work and we cross those bridges. When you celebrate the unique contributions, skills, strengths, ideas, and core values of those you work and live with, you make a far greater impact than you will ever know in your lifetime, and a far greater impact than you could make on your own. When you're willing to understand them within that generational framework, you will be that impactful leader. So I'm really curious. How will you use this information today in your life? Are you more or less likely to dive in and discover your own core values, your non-negotiables, your inner compass? I want to know. I'd love to hear from you. DM me on Instagram or LinkedIn. Email me, Andrea@theintentionaloptimist.com. Reply to my newsletter. Or if you're listening on a podcast app, or if you're in YouTube, like, subscribe, follow, share, leave me a comment. I'd love to know. It's time to stand tall and own it. Stand tall and own your non-negotiables, and you can become an impactful leader who fosters diversity and authentic leadership across generations. What's stopping you? Let's do this. Until next time.